All right, let's continue our discussions around the VAT hike increase, or that's, I suppose, saying the same thing twice, but the VAT increase reversal. We're joined now by Professor Miriam Altman. She's a former commissioner of the National Planning Commission. Prof, it's great to have you on. Thanks for joining us. And, I want to ask you, what is the immediate financial relief that people in our country can now feel, given that it's official, that 0.5 percentage point hike will not come into effect on the 1st of May. But the fact is, consumers are still under incredible amount of pressure.
Yeah, I see it a little differently. They were going to introduce more zero VAT rated items. I think the real issue is that the opposition, the ANC may not have handled the introduction of a 2% or 0.5% VAT increase in the way that they should have in a GNU, but the opposition may not also realize the work that needs to be done to create efficiency in the budget. That money was going to be used for infrastructure and for the hiring of teachers and health workers. Mm-hmm. So yes, more efficiency. There's no doubt that more efficiency should be found in the budget. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But it doesn't happen in a minute. I'd love to see whoever's are detractors of the VAT increase to be finding what those solutions are and ensuring that the net result is not that particularly low-income schools are under pressure with fewer teachers, healthcare centers have insufficient numbers of healthcare workers, and et cetera. So actually the poor are going to be badly affected.
So Prof. Altman, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're not celebrating the decision to reverse the VAT hike?
No, I'm not. I'm not saying I'm loving having an increase in taxes and in VAT. Of course, I would rather have lower VAT, like anybody. What I'm aware of, however, is that the hard work has not been done to find those efficiencies, and they must be found, and they should be known by now, and people who are arguing this point should be a little bit more aware of what those are. And in the meantime, I'm very well aware, because I work with some of these schools. I have programs that work with youth, and I'm very aware of the pressure that schools are under. And what's happened is that because nobody seems to want to make a decision about getting better efficiencies, that it's a non-decision. So what's happened is that it got, this decision to make cuts went to the provinces, and what the provinces did is they didn't fill posts for teachers and health workers. Mm. That's what the net effect was. So now low-income schools are under pressure without math teachers, very high and rising pupil-teacher ratios. And some of that money was going to be going to the turnaround of the metros, because Treasury is driving a very intense program of turnarounds in relation to water, electricity services in the metros. I'm very deeply engaged with that right now. And a lot of that money was going to go to that as well. So let's have a proper conversation about what this is.
But surely, Prof, we can find the money elsewhere without putting consumers under more pressure?
Sure, definitely. Finding points of improved efficiency in government's expenditure, definitely you could find improvements, and then you've got to do the work. It could be in procurement and administration. There are so many places where more efficiency could be gained in the way public spending goes. Even in things that people are a bit invisible to people. So people often think about public personnel and that kind of thing, and there may be efficiencies, but there's often efficiencies that can be gained in operational improvements that don't even cut people. But that hard work's not being done. Mm. Now, the one place that I am aware of, I'm not saying it's the only place, but the place that I'm aware of, because I'm very involved in water security work at the metro level right now, is in these turnarounds that Treasury is effecting to get better bang for buck for public expenditure in services at the metropolitan level. And there that means electricity, water, waste, sanitation, those kinds of very critical services. So there's a whole turnaround process. And some part of this increase was going to go to that work that improves metro services. Now, so there's no doubt that efficiencies can be gained, but then it needs to happen, and it doesn't happen in 5 minutes.
No, absolutely. Just taking a look at the AG's report, when we look at the various municipalities, We now have this revenue shortfall, right, of 75 billion rand. Just going municipality by municipality, and when we look at money lost to fruitless and wasteful expenditure, I reckon a lot of that 75 billion rand hole could be plugged.
There's no doubt that that spending hole could be plugged. There's going to be some heavy lifting to do it. Now, there's been some great work in Treasury to do these expenditure reviews and to find places where efficiency could be gained. The work I did on the infrastructure plan for government shows what some of those places are as well. But then that work needs to be done. In the meantime, this spending is needed. So the problem is the timing of it. That hard work needs to be done. But in the meantime, we need these doctors, we need these nurses, we need these teachers to be in place. So finding those savings, it's not going to happen in the next month.
Yeah.
Should it happen? Absolutely. But a half a percentage, I think people are thinking this is going to hurt the poor, but actually about 70% of that is paid for by well-to-do people. And they were going to increase the number of zero-rated items, and then the poor get hit with this reliance on public services, public schools, public health services, and are going to get heavily hit on that side now. So all I'm saying is we need a proper conversation about what this means. So if people are going to be holding the ANC to account in opposition or in the GNU, I'd like to see a full conversation on these things. What's happened is, and driving that conversation is incredibly important. But what I see more of is, I find this a bit grandstanding-ish, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So as I said, I think the ANC, I won't say that, Treasury could have handled the VAT increase differently in bringing its partners on board. But I'd love to see the other parties driving a more constructive, informed discussion on these things that really drives change.
Right, because the alternative to that, which is what we have been seeing, is sort of politicizing the entire process and trying to say, well, I was right or you were wrong.
Yeah, and as we sometimes do, it's so much easier to focus on an issue like VAT because it's sort of one word, it's got 3 letters, it's very easy to focus on. And the set of issues is much more complicated. And I would love to see parties getting, I haven't seen an intelligent discussion about it, quite frankly. I see, the DA saying they want to have a role in Operation Vulindlela, which actually is running pretty well and is a bit of a showpiece. So it's not really a concern per se. We'd like to see changes in BEE rules, things like that, as opposed to how do we get more impact out of infrastructure so it's more growth orientated? How do we get long-range negotiations in respect to public personnel to get a remuneration strategy that starts to stabilize remuneration and get better service from public servants and a better balance in the balance of employment in the public sector? How do we drive these turnarounds in metros and make sure they run better? Like real things.
Prof, you mentioned earlier the expansion of the basket of zero-rated goods also goes away along with the VAT hike. Right. Is that correct?
Right. That's right.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating because I'm just looking back at some of what the Auditor General had to say about wasteful expenditure, about overspending by government departments and public entities. And year after year, for 2024, that overspending amount was almost 40 billion rand. And year after year, we hear these numbers, right? And, you're talking about the fact that it's not going to plug the hole that needs to be filled now by that 75 billion rand revenue shortfall. But what have we been doing all of this time? The Auditor General's been issuing these warnings. Every quarter goes by and the numbers become more and more shocking. When is a good time to start?
Okay, so the first thing is that there's no doubt that there is a financial management problem across government and that the capability needs to grow in terms of management. We also know that our system of auditing and the the accounting requirements in government probably are too onerous for what government can cope with. So what you find is a lot of people in government try to comply with rules, and they're often often what's happening including at a municipal level is that people are told, departments are told that it's wasteful or fruitless expenditure, and sometimes they're very minor things. So it's almost impossible to comply with the rules that are there. And so there needs to be a think about that, which is not the topic of today, but let's be fair. The other issue probably is not so much over expenditure, it's often under expenditure, funny enough, that money is handed back, which is actually incredibly frustrating. You'd rather have under expenditure than over expenditure, but you'd rather have expenditure for an impact. But anyway, you actually see a lot of money being returned, actually. Now, when I was referring to the shortfall, what I was trying to remind people of is Treasury was making the point that there are increased items. For whatever reason, they added 230 billion to the MTEF between October and February, which is hard to understand in a budgeting process. So that right there is we could do a whole show on that particular set of issues, because that's not how a national budgeting process should run. It should be more stable. But having said that, what they haven't included is they're thinking that there's only going to be a COVID SRD grant for 1 year. Mm-hmm. But of course that isn't going to happen. We know that. So they haven't budgeted for the second 2 years. So basically 70 billion of COVID SRD isn't in there. 10 billion for employment programs. Of course, we're going to have employment programs. If they're going to cut employment programs, I'm going to cry in a country with this much unemployment. Those programs are so important. So right there, you've got 80 billion rand that is not in this budget for the outer 2 years of the 3-year medium-term expenditure framework that gets published. That's actually what I was talking about. So the increase in VAT and whatever else they do, targeted at what they were saying would be in the budget, is still not covering that extra 80 billion that they're going to have to come back to. I don't know if does that make sense?
It does, and you're right, Prof. It is incredibly frustrating especially when you're talking about the underspending, the money that's sent back to Treasury. Ironically, when we put that side by side with what the AG has to say every year about overspending, underspending means, on the one hand, that services aren't being delivered. On the other hand, do we prefer underspending to overspending? I don't know.
Well, what we want to see is performance. If you're spending, and this is where I've been doing a lot of work over the past period of years, how do you get better performance for public spending and infrastructure? Because that's very growth inducing. It's incredibly important area of work. So at the extreme, you have the kind of case of what happened with PRASA or Transnet during years of state capture, where, like in PRASA, 80 billion rand basically went overseas. That was capital investment, and PRASA basically shut down its service for a period of years. So that's like the worst possible thing that can happen. What happens in less extreme cases is just that you don't get the performance from the spending. Now that's quite common globally, but that's where we need to start having an impact. So this is why I'm referring to the turnaround program that Treasury is driving in the 8 metros in the country. I'm personally working with 4 of those 8 metros currently. And that's an incredibly important program to get better performance in these key services that metros deliver. And, better revenue collection, better delivery, better bang for buck, basically, and more investment, therefore, going into it. These are the kinds of programs we need to see happening. Now, as I say, a big part of that VAT increase was meant to go to infrastructure spending related. Basically, the metros are going to be incentivized to improve their performance. Then they get more money for infrastructure investment. And now that falls away. Now, should you source it from somewhere? Yeah, I guess so. But there isn't that much discretionary spending in the budget. It's not as easy as one might imagine. There's not a lot of loose change to move around. These things are quite substantial changes that are required, yeah. And there are a lot of interests that kind of keep things in place. So it's not a quick fix, and it requires very strong leadership.
Yeah, it certainly does. And thank you for that perspective. Professor Miriam Altman is I'm sorry to say, a former commissioner of the National Planning Commission, but giving us a different perspective. We've heard from political parties celebrating the reversal of the VAT hike that would have come into effect on the 1st of May. Prof. Altman tells us the VAT hike reversal won't solve the challenges that our country faces. We need a lot more heavy lifting.